A millionaire saves his secretary's life, and she ends up falling in love with him, even though he is married. He then decides to create a plan that changes her life forever.
Before we begin the story, write in the comments where you're watching from.
Lisa adjusted her heels in the silent corridor, her hands slightly clammy and her heart racing in a way she couldn't disguise. It wasn't the kind of reaction she usually had when walking into Alexander Kane's office. For the 5 years she had worked for him, their relationship had always been practical, almost mechanical. Direct questions, brief answers, and an unspoken understanding that he was untouchable. But now, after everything that had happened, nothing seemed so simple anymore. A month had passed since the accident. Since that day when, distracted and in a rush, she had stepped into the street without noticing the car speeding toward her. And since Alexander, in an instinctive reaction that seemed completely out of character, had pulled her out of harm's way, leaving her breathless and shaken but alive. He hadn't just saved her life. He had paid every cent of her medical bills, visited her in the hospital, and insisted she take all the time she needed to recover. The man she had thought of as a cold, pragmatic businessman had shown her something different, and it had unsettled her in ways she was still trying to understand. Lisa took a deep breath, trying to push from her mind the smile he had given her on the day she returned to work. A smile that seemed to say, "You don't need to thank me. It's just what anyone would do." But she knew that wasn't true. Alexander Kane wasn't just anyone. She knocked on the door with her knuckles and waited. "Come in." His voice, muffled through the wood, still carried the same commanding weight it always did. Lisa opened the door, careful to make sure her steps didn't seem rushed, and stopped a few feet from his desk. Alexander looked up from his laptop, his expression calm but assessing. It was impossible to completely read him. "Do you need something?" He closed the laptop and leaned back in his chair. "You asked me to bring the market analysis report." Lisa held up the folder in her hand and stepped closer, trying to ignore the way his gaze seemed to settle on her. There was nothing unusual in the way he looked at her, but she felt its weight in a way she never had before. "Right. Leave it here." He gestured to the corner of his desk. She did as he asked but lingered a second too long. Alexander noticed. He always noticed. "Is something wrong?" Lisa opened her mouth to respond but closed it again. What could she say? "Yes, something's wrong. Ever since you saved me, every time I look at you, I feel this strange pull in my chest that I don't know how to handle." No, that wasn't an acceptable answer. "Nothing," she replied, with a smile that felt unconvincing even to her. Alexander tilted his head slightly, as if he were trying to figure her out. "Are you okay, Lisa?" It was a simple question, but the way he asked it, with a tone of genuine curiosity, caught her off guard. He had never been the type to ask things like that before the accident. He had never noticed anything outside of routine. But now, there was something different between them, something even he didn't seem to fully understand. "I'm fine." She hesitated, then added, "It's just that I never really thanked you properly, you know? For everything. Not just the hospital, but for," her voice faltered and she looked away, feeling her face heat up. "Saving my life." Alexander was silent for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "You don't need to thank me. I do." She raised her eyes to him, feeling a strange courage stir inside her. "You've done more for me than anyone ever has. And I don't even know how to repay that." He gave her a brief, almost melancholic smile. "There's nothing to repay, Lisa. It was an impulsive decision. I didn't think. I just acted." "Even so." She looked at him, her voice steady now. "It meant a lot. More than you realize." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. Alexander held her gaze longer than necessary, as if trying to make sense of something. Finally, he stood and walked around the desk, stopping just a few steps from her. He no longer seemed like the untouchable CEO. He seemed human. "You're recovered. That's what matters," he said, his words slow, almost as if testing them. Lisa nodded but couldn't bring herself to move. They stood there in that small space, with a tension that felt almost tangible, until he broke eye contact and stepped back. "Well, I have a meeting in 10 minutes. We need to discuss the garrison contract later. Let me know when you're ready." She nodded, feeling the moment slip away like sand between her fingers. But before she could leave, she heard him say, almost as if speaking to himself, "It shouldn't have been so easy to lose you." Lisa froze at the door but didn't turn around. She wasn't sure if he wanted her to hear that. And honestly, she didn't know how to respond. The following days were marked by a silent tension that seemed to grow between Lisa and Alexander. It wasn't explicit, but it lingered in the space between words and in glances that lasted a second too long. Lisa tried to hide it, but her body betrayed her in small ways. A slight blush when he walked into the room, a smile that was too hesitant when he made a joke, or the way her voice softened whenever she spoke directly to him. Alexander wasn't the kind of man who ignored signs. And the signs were all there. It was during a late afternoon meeting, with the golden sunlight streaming through the office's large windows, that he finally became certain. Lisa was taking notes in her notebook but seemed more distracted than usual. He finished presenting a point and asked, "Lisa, what do you think?" She blinked, as if snapped out of a distant thought. "Sorry, Mr. Kane, could you repeat that?" The way she avoided his gaze was enough for him to understand. He knew how to recognize admiration, even when it was masked, and he also knew how to recognize something more. For a moment, he considered confronting her but decided against it. It wouldn't be fair. He wasn't sure if she was ready to face it, nor if he was. Later, at the end of the workday, Lisa was organizing papers at her desk when he walked by, stopping at her side. "I need help with some documents at home tonight. Can you come over?" She looked at him, surprised. "Your house?" "Yes." He said it as if it were the most casual thing in the world. "Nothing complicated. Just something I want to review before tomorrow's meeting with the legal team." For a moment, Lisa stood still, as if trying to decipher what was happening. He had never invited her to his house before. It was far too personal, especially considering Alexander was married. Not that he talked much about it. His wife, Evelyn, seemed to exist only as an occasional name in conversations, a vague figure in the background of his life. Even so, Lisa hesitated. "Sure," she finally replied, trying to sound practical, though her mind was a swirl of confusion. "What time?" "9. I'll send you the address." She nodded, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach that arose whenever he was near. As Alexander walked toward the elevator, she watched his silhouette disappear behind the metal doors, trying to convince herself that this was strictly work-related. "He's married, Lisa." "Married? Evelyn is probably traveling or busy." Nothing to it. But even as she repeated those words, they felt unconvincing. She knew very well what might happen that night. When the time came, Lisa parked her car in front of Alexander's house, a discreet yet imposing mansion on a tree-lined street that looked straight out of a movie. That invitation still left her uneasy, and her mind wouldn't stop questioning his intentions. During the drive, she tried to rationalize. Maybe he really just needs help with documents. Maybe I'm seeing signals that aren't there. But there was another possibility, one she was reluctant to admit, yet it made her heart race. What if Alexander had finally acknowledged the tension between them? He knew about her feelings. It was impossible not to. And maybe, just maybe, tonight was the start of something. When the front door opened before she even had the chance to ring the bell, Lisa felt a chill. Alexander stood there, wearing only his shirt sleeves and tailored pants, a stark contrast to the impeccably formal man she saw in the office. The smile he gave her was friendly but distant. Something felt off. "Lisa, punctual as always. Come in." She stepped inside, taking in the scent of polished wood and something citrusy, probably from an expensive diffuser. Before she could ask about the documents, voices drifted from the living room. And then, as if crossing an invisible threshold, everything in her head collapsed. In the living room, Evelyn Kane was seated on one of the cream leather sofas, as impeccable as a painting. Her blonde hair fell perfectly over her shoulders, and she possessed the kind of effortless elegance that seemed almost unreal. She raised her eyes when she saw Lisa and offered a polished smile, though it lacked warmth. "You must be Lisa," Evelyn said in a low, almost musical voice. "Alexander speaks so much about you." Before Lisa could respond, another figure entered her line of sight. A tall man in a casual suit, with a presence that filled the room in an unsettling way. His easy smile and piercing blue eyes were as disarming as they were striking. "Miss." He extended his hand toward Lisa, his grip firm and confident. "Alex's friend from college. And you're the famous Lisa. Finally we meet." Lisa felt her cheeks flush, unable to hide her surprise. "Famous?" She shot a quick glance at Alexander, but he was at the bar, pouring a glass of wine for Evelyn, acting as though everything were perfectly normal. "Oh, well, I don't know if I'm that famous," Lisa murmured, trying to regain her composure as she shook Thomas's hand. His touch was warm, almost too comfortable. "You're being modest," Thomas said, with a half-smile that seemed designed to disarm anyone. "Alex always praises your efficiency, but he never mentioned you were so charming." Lisa blinked, unsure how to respond. This was an unexpected turn for the evening. She had prepared for something entirely different, a private meeting, perhaps even an intimate one. But now she was here, face to face with Alexander's wife and a man who looked like he had stepped out of a fragrance campaign, and she couldn't make sense of it. "Wine?" Alexander asked, holding up a glass toward her. "Oh yes, thank you." Lisa accepted the glass, trying not to let the tremor in her fingers show. She sat in a nearby armchair, feeling like an out-of-place piece in a scene that seemed too choreographed. "Alexander told us you're a rare talent," Evelyn continued, her serene tone making Lisa feel uncomfortably exposed. "He's always had a knack for recognizing when he's in the presence of something special." Lisa offered a timid smile, feeling the weight of Evelyn's observation. Was it a genuine compliment or some kind of test? She looked at Alexander, who was now beside Thomas, the two of them talking about something she couldn't catch. He didn't seem inclined to intervene, which only unsettled her further. "So, Lisa," Thomas said, settling casually into the sofa across from her and resting an arm on the backrest. "What did Alex promise to get you out of the house on a Friday night? I hope it wasn't just work." "Well, he mentioned some documents," Lisa replied, forcing a smile, trying to appear more confident than she felt. Thomas chuckled, a genuine sound that filled the room. "That's typical. He knows how to get people to do things, doesn't he?" Lisa glanced at Alexander, who finally lifted his gaze to meet hers, a shadow of a smile playing on his lips. It was impossible to tell what he was thinking, but that look seemed to carry a weight no one else in the room could perceive. "That's true," Alexander said, his tone light. "But Lisa knows it's never just about work. It's always been more than that." And then, he turned his attention back to Evelyn, as if those words hadn't been a declaration in themselves. Lisa felt her heart race again, but she couldn't tell if it was because of Alexander, or because of Thomas's curious, attentive gaze, which seemed to miss nothing. The night was only beginning. Lisa gripped her wine glass tightly, trying to steady herself in a night that was unfolding in completely unexpected ways. Evelyn's presence had already been a shock. Thomas's was an enigma. And now a dinner. No documents, no work. Just Alexander, his wife, and a man who seemed designed to throw her off balance. Seated at the table, Lisa followed fragments of the conversation without really participating. Evelyn spoke with the calculated grace of someone who effortlessly commanded any room, while Thomas interjected with occasional comments that made everyone laugh, including Lisa, though she wasn't sure why. Alexander seemed calm, but there was something about the way he glanced at her, fleeting but deliberate, that suggested he was waiting for the right moment. The dinner continued this way, a careful dance of words and glances, until Alexander finally placed his napkin beside his plate and stood. "Lisa, can I steal you for a moment?" he asked, his casual tone betraying none of his intent. She nodded, feeling a knot in her stomach, and followed him out of the dining room, down a hallway that led to an elegant study lined with perfectly arranged bookshelves. He softly closed the door behind them and leaned against the desk, and then she thought, "My God, is it going to happen now? With his wife and another guy I've never seen in my life also in the house. You're confused, aren't you?" He began with an almost sad smile. "Confused would be an understatement," Lisa replied, trying to keep her tone light, though she could feel the tension mounting. "This isn't exactly what I expected when you invited me." Alexander let out a brief laugh, looking at the floor before lifting his gaze back to hers. "I figured as much. But if you'll allow me, I'd like to explain." Lisa remained silent, waiting. "A long time ago, I wasn't the man you know today," he began, pausing as if carefully choosing his words. "When Evelyn and I got married, I was impulsive, selfish, cheated more than once. Not because I didn't love her, but because I thought I could do whatever I wanted without consequences." Lisa tried to hide her surprise, but he noticed. "I know how that sounds. Believe me, I hate admitting it, but it's the truth. And while I was doing everything wrong, Thomas," he sighed, the name heavy in the air, "he was the opposite. Perfect husband. He loved his wife with everything he had, treated her like she was the center of his world. He was always scolding me, telling me I was ruining the most precious thing I had. And I ignored him." Alexander paused, running a hand over his face, as if reliving those moments was exhausting. "Then 3 years ago his wife Sophie got sick. Cancer. Quick, devastating. I watched my best friend endure the slow loss of the woman he loved most in the world, powerless to do anything. He never complained, never withdrew. He stayed by her side until the end, loving her unconditionally, even when he knew he was losing her." Lisa felt a tightness in her chest as he spoke, but she remained silent. "That's what hit me," Alexander continued. "Seeing Thomas, I realized I had never truly valued what I had. That I was living in a way that couldn't lead anywhere good. And I changed. Truly changed. For Evelyn, for myself. But mostly because I realized that compared to Thomas, I was small. He's the best man I've ever known. Far better than I ever was or ever will be." Alexander looked at her, his expression serious. "And he's been single for 2 years now, since he lost Sophie. Not because he doesn't want to move forward, but because it's hard to find someone who truly reaches him, you know?" Lisa nodded, though she felt like she could barely breathe. She knew where this was going but didn't want to believe it. "When he saw you tonight, he was captivated," Alexander said, with a simplicity that made Lisa blink in confusion. "He didn't say it outright, but I know him. I saw it in his eyes. And believe me, Lisa, you deserve someone like Thomas. Someone who can give you everything with no reservations in the purest way. He was enchanted by you." She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The confusion and turmoil inside her were so overwhelming that she couldn't form a coherent response. Thomas was captivated. And Alexander was standing here, essentially pushing her toward another man. The sheer bewilderment was almost too much to bear. "I know this is a lot all at once," Alexander added softly. "And I'm not saying you have to do anything right now. I just wanted you to know." Lisa felt the weight of his gaze, so sincere it left her shaken. And for the first time, she realized that Alexander wasn't just being altruistic. He was protecting himself, building a barrier between them that she could never cross. Lisa returned to the dining table, still reeling from the conversation. Every word Alexander had said seemed to echo in her mind as she struggled to process it all. It wasn't just his story or the revelation about Thomas. It was the brutal clarity of what he had told her. The way he described Thomas as someone far better than himself, and how genuinely committed he seemed to valuing his wife made one thing painfully clear. Alexander wasn't meant for her. He never would be. And it hurt. The passion she had felt for him was overwhelming, and she had arrived that night full of expectations. She didn't want to think about Thomas. Sitting back down, Lisa tried to compose herself, but Thomas was there, with that easy smile and an attentive gaze that seemed to see right through her. He was, in fact, kind, not just in the way he spoke but in how he listened. While Evelyn told a light-hearted story about a new project she was working on, Thomas paid attention as if it were the most interesting thing in the world. Lisa noticed that Thomas had an unassuming charm, different from Alexander, whose presence was almost overwhelming. Thomas seemed more approachable, more human. But what truly unsettled her was the way he looked at her, not in an invasive or indiscreet way, but with genuine curiosity. It was as if he were trying to understand who she was, as if every word or gesture of hers held significance. As the dinner progressed, Lisa found herself gradually relaxing, laughing at some of Thomas's jokes, and even joining Evelyn in a conversation about travel. Evelyn, to her surprise, was delightful, intelligent, witty, and clearly in love with Alexander. The way she smiled at her husband and the way he returned the gesture with soft, affectionate glances made Lisa realize something she hadn't wanted to admit until then. Alexander was happy. It wasn't a facade. He truly loved his wife, and Evelyn's presence made that undeniably clear. Lisa felt a tightness in her chest, but this time it wasn't pain. It was a sense of shame. The idea of harboring feelings for someone so clearly committed, so resolved in his marriage, now seemed small and petty. She knew she needed to let it go. More importantly, she wanted to. Thomas, however, was becoming increasingly impossible to ignore. He was charming without being arrogant, persuasive without being pushy. And when he shared stories about his travels or the small art gallery he owned, Lisa found herself leaning toward him, almost without realizing it. It wasn't just his appearance or his voice. It was the way he asked questions, as if every answer was a piece of something larger he wanted to uncover about her. When the dinner concluded, Alexander and Evelyn began clearing the dishes, and Thomas stood by the table, watching Lisa as she finished her glass of wine. For a moment, he didn't say anything, just looked at her, the smile lingering on his lips. "It was a pleasant evening, wasn't it?" he said at last. Lisa nodded. "Yes, it was. I don't think I expected it to be like this." "You didn't expect to be like what?" He tilted his head, curious. She hesitated, then smiled. "So welcoming." "Well, I'm glad you felt that way. But, to be fair, I think you were the biggest reason for that." She raised her eyebrows, surprised. "Me?" Thomas shrugged casually. "You're captivating, Lisa. It's not something you seem to realize, but you should." She was speechless, her face warming. Before she could come up with a response, he pulled his phone from his pocket and held it out to her. "Can I have your number? I'd like to invite you for coffee someday. Just the two of us." Lisa blinked, stunned. Just the two of us. The simplicity of the proposition felt both surreal and unexpectedly exhilarating. Did he really want to spend more time with her? Someone so confident, so charming, and so clearly above any standard she had ever encountered. Her hand trembled slightly as she took his phone and typed in her number. When she handed it back, he glanced at the screen and smiled, satisfied. "Perfect. I hope I don't take too long to call." She laughed, trying to mask her nervousness. "I hope so too." As Thomas walked off to help Alexander and Evelyn in the kitchen, Lisa remained seated, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, awe. Not just for Thomas but for the way he saw her. Somehow, he had recognized something in her that she had never seen in herself. Something that, for the first time, made her feel like more than just a woman trying to get by. He felt special. Some months later, Lisa and Thomas eventually began a relationship, a genuine connection that grew and flourished. Thomas revealed himself to be exactly as Alexander had described. A kind, patient man, completely transparent about his past and the challenges he had faced after losing Sophie. Lisa, in turn, felt truly seen in a way she had never experienced before. Not only did Thomas admire her, but he also encouraged her to grow, to believe in herself, and to explore new dreams she had long abandoned. At the same time, Lisa began to see Alexander and Evelyn differently. The admiration she once felt for Alexander evolved into something healthier, more realistic, as she came to understand how essential Evelyn was to his life. Their marriage, though not perfect, was solid, built on effort and mutual respect. Evelyn, with her natural warmth, also began to draw closer to Lisa, not as someone distant or unapproachable, but as a potential friend. One evening, during a dinner at Alexander and Evelyn's home, the four of them shared laughter and stories. Lisa, sitting beside Thomas, realized how much things had changed since that first dinner. The tension that once existed between her and Alexander had been replaced by lightness, a quiet understanding that they had taken different paths but could still be part of each other's lives. Thomas, ever playful, suggested a group trip, something light and fun to break their routines. Evelyn, excited, proposed Napa Valley, while Alexander rolled his eyes dramatically, pretending to protest. Lisa laughed along with everyone, feeling completely at ease, as though she had finally found a place where she truly belonged, a circle of friends who understood her. At the dinner table, with everyone present, Lisa held Thomas's hand under the table, knowing that although her heart had faced confusion and uncertainty in the beginning, she had finally found something real. Not just love, but friendship, understanding, and a group of people who, in different ways, had forever changed her life.
If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel. We need your support. Share your thoughts about the story in the comments below. Thank you so much.